As we continue our journey through Mystagogia and RCIA, I'm excited to talk to you this week about Catholic social teachings. Once again, this is a topic that probably not all Catholics can speak very well to, but if you look at this quote, you'll understand why this is a very important topic for all of us to consider. Quote, Catholic social teaching is a central and essential element of our faith. Catholic social teaching has roots in the Hebrew prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, David, Daniel. Many of the Hebrew prophets announced God's special love for the poor and called people to a covenant of love and justice. But Catholic social teaching is really founded on the life and words of Jesus Christ. It says in Luke's Gospel that he came to bring glad tidings to the poor, liberty to captives, and recovery of sight to the blind. Throughout the scriptures, Jesus identified himself with the least of these, the hungry, the stranger, the lost, the blind, and asked us over and over again to serve them. In doing so, he said, we were really serving him, disguised as the poor. Catholic social teaching is built then on a commitment to the poor. And this commitment comes from our experiences of Christ in the Eucharist. This might seem a little bit surprising to you, but let's look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church that explains, to receive in truth the body and blood of Christ given up for us, we must recognize Christ in the poorest of his brethren. This is something that I don't think very many Catholics ever think about when they go to communion. But there it is, essential in our teachings. Catholic social teaching emerges from the truth of what God has revealed to us. Let's think about this for a minute. What has God revealed to us about who God really is? We are given this image of a triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, which is communal and social. Therefore, our image of God should be the same. It's not a God who is one God alone, but rather as one who is relational, reflected and mirrored in all of creation and in all of our relationships. This is what we call the Trinity. So if we're made in God's image, then we share this communal social nature. And because we share it, and everyone shares it, it's not just me, then we're called to reach out and to build relationships of love and justice. Catholic social teaching, then, is based on and inseparable from our understanding of human life and human dignity. You've heard me talk about this over and over again, and I think it's very clear to the whole world how Christians view human life. We are all created in the image of God. We are all redeemed by Christ, and therefore every individual is invaluable and worthy of respect as a member of the human family. And that is why you hear Christians talk so much about wanting to protect human life from the moment of creation to the moment of natural death. It's about this inherent dignity. It's about what we call a right to life. A right to life consistent with that dignity, which comes from God alone and not from any human quality or accomplishment. So we have to say then that our commitment to Catholic social mission has to be rooted in and strengthened by our spiritual lives. Last week I told talked to you a long time about spirituality and the importance of developing a deep and committed one for yourself. This is the only way, through this relationship, through this spiritual life, that we can experience a conversion of heart that is a heart big enough, necessary, to truly love one another as God has loved us. Left to our own devices, most of us would be pretty selfish. But rooted in God, we learn how to reach out and care for all of us. The Catholic Church has had a long history of service to the poor. You can see this from the very beginning. In the early church, they held everything in common and were very, very concerned that everyone would have equal access to their property and wealth. You can see this down through the scriptures, through the early history of the church, and so forth. But in the last 120 years, popes have begun to speak out and teach these principles. Eventually, they began to write letters. These are called encyclicals, to remind and direct us in these matters. Now, I have to say that the church and the popes have been highly criticized for writing these letters and concerning themselves with social issues. And oftentimes you hear people criticizing and saying that the church should stay out of politics. But in reality, we have to realize that social teachings are not about politics. These social teachings that I'm going to lay out for you today are based on the gospel teachings of Christ, applied to the modern world. So if we say we're Christians, then we have to stay true to what Jesus taught and the way he lived his life. The church, in witness to the gospel of Christ, then, also has the obligation to teach, direct, speak up when human rights are violated. Because when human rights are violated, the gospel is compromised. I dare say, rewritten sometimes. We have this interpretive view based on our own needs or viewpoints that might clash with really what the church is teaching. As I said, popes are often chastised for speaking out on human rights issues. But what else can they do? They're our leaders, the leaders of our church. If they're not following the gospel, how can they expect us to? The popes are the shepherds. And today, look at here, Pope Francis. He's the shepherd of a flock of over 1 billion people on this planet. He has to show us the way. He has to stand up for human rights, because otherwise he's not following the gospel. So again, criticisms all around about the church getting involved in politics and so forth, but really, once again, it's not about that at all. I'm going to go now back into history and give you 120 years of social teachings based on the encyclicals, the letters from the popes. Again, this goes back to the early church, but about 120 years ago, they began writing about social teachings. The first encyclical, the first letter that was written, was called Rerum Novarum, The Rights and Duties of Capital and Labor, written by Pope Leo XIII in the year 1891. Think about what was happening in history. The Industrial Revolution had taken hold. Many people had fled the country and were now crowded into big cities, working in factories. Children were working as well as adults, and there were many, many abuses. And so the Pope thought it necessary to speak out, to have the church say something that addressed the misery and wretchedness pressing so unjustly on the majority of the working class at the time. In this letter, he supports the rights of labor to form unions. He rejected socialism as well as unrestricted capitalism. The two extreme forms of the way that we were organizing in our world. And think about what was going on in Europe at this time as well. So he said both of these in their extreme were bad. That we had to affirm the rights of workers as they were, as their dignity called for. In this letter, he also affirmed the right to private property, something that will come up again in some of the later encyclicals. 40 years later, Pope Pius XI wrote another encyclical, Quadragesimo Anno, written in 1931. Again, place this in history. What was going on in our world? He wrote it to discuss the ethical implications of the social and economic order. He described the major dangers for human freedom and dignity that came from this unrestricted capitalism and the totalitarianism of the social or communist regimes. So the Pope again was speaking out in favor of human rights. He was calling for the reconstruction of the social order based on two principles, solidarity and subsidiarity. Solidarity basically meaning that we're all in this together, and therefore we have the duty to help one another. Subsidiarity has to do with sharing the work, allowing everyone to exercise their free gifts. And again, these two principles will come up once again in many of the letters that follow. Let's go ahead to 1961. Pope John the 23rd. And look, his picture was on the cover of Time magazine. He wrote an encyclical called Mater et Magistra, or Mother and Teacher. In it, he refers to the role of the Church in promoting the necessity of all of us to work towards what he called authentic community, so that we could promote human dignity and the common good. The Church then is the guidance here, nurturing us and teaching us like a mother. And he said that the state should be like that too, and that when there were crises in healthcare, education, and housing and so forth, that the state sometimes had to intervene in these matters and help out. 1961, think about it. We're in the middle of racial discrimination in America. We are on the brink of the modern world and all the technology that is to come. And so promoting an authentic community of human dignity was very much on his mind in those days and would be in the years to come. In 1963, Pope John the 23rd wrote another very famous encyclical called Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. In 1963, we had been through 2 world wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War was just getting amped up, and many other conflicts all over the world. We had dropped an atom bomb during World War II. We were now capable of annihilating the whole planet. And so he felt the need then to reiterate the conditions of peace and said that peace was a responsibility of everyone, not just the scientists and the rich and powerful. Again, we were in the middle of the Cold War, coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And by the way, during that crisis, the Vatican served as an intermediary between the White House and the Kremlin. The Pope had this experience of the need to try to resolve the difficulties arising out of this four-power occupation of Berlin as well. Remember that the peace encyclical was issued only 2 years after the erection of the Berlin Wall. And so peace on earth became an amazing statement that people still refer to today, one that we have not yet attained. In 1965, we had a new pope, Pope Paul VI, and one of the first things that he did was write Gaudium et Spes, which was an encyclical of joy and hope regarding the Second Vatican Council. In fact, when you look at the documents of Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes is one of the bookend documents, the very first one that you read when you read the documents. Let's look at this quote. Pope Paul says, "The joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the people of our time, especially of those who are poor or afflicted, are the joys and hopes, the grief and anguish of the followers of Christ as well." So basically he's saying that we have solidarity with those who are suffering, especially those who are suffering. In Gaudium et Spes, Pope Paul VI talks about the Church's teachings on our relationship to economics, poverty, social justice, culture, science, technology, and ecumenism. What is that? Ecumenism basically is looking at the cooperation and similarities between and among faith traditions. We are still talking about ecumenism today. In 1967, Pope Paul VI also made the cover of Time magazine with his encyclical Populorum Progressio on the development of peoples. In this encyclical, the Pope states that the economy of the world should serve humankind, all of us, not just a few people. Again, he reiterated what was said in previous encyclicals, especially going all the way back to Rerum Novarum, that everyone has the right to a just wage, the right to security of employment, and fair and reasonable working conditions. This would include the right to join a union, however you feel about that. The Pope insists that we should have that right. And most of all, the universal destination of resources and goods. I'm sure you have seen all of the statistics there are and how much the United States and first world countries consume, so much more than any other countries in the world. We also produce a lot, but we consume a lot too. So he's saying that everyone should have a right to those resources and goods. In 1971, here we go with Paul VI again. After 80 years since Rerum Novarum, he wrote another encyclical, A Call to Action. In it, he discusses the role of individual Christians and local churches in responding to injustices. Now look at how he's becoming more and more focused on every single person. Not saying that it's just the responsibility of big government or big church, but that everyone has to do their part. And he involves lay people, and that's you and I. Anybody that's not in the clergy are considered lay people. It's our task to improve the temporal order, he said. We have a duty of using our own initiative and taking action at issues of social injustice. In 1971, there were many protests going on all over the world, protesting the war, protesting racial injustice, protesting working conditions, and so on and so on. In this letter, the Pope is sort of giving everyone an affirmation and saying, yes, it is your responsibility. Every one of us has to work for social justice. By 1981, we had a new Pope, Pope John Paul II. And one of his first encyclicals was about human work again, Laborem Exercens. By 1981, the technological revolution was expanding quickly. Every business pretty much had computers, and soon every home would have a personal computer. And I don't know if Pope John Paul realized it, but eventually everyone would have a computer in their pocket. But in 1981, he felt the need to write this encyclical about the increased use of technology, especially information technology. Once more, he goes back to the dignity of work for all people and addresses also that this environmental concern that as we work, we have to not only be concerned about the work itself and the person doing it, but also how it affects the environment. Once more, he says labor has to take precedence over capital. In other words, people are more important than the things that they produce. He also introduced a concept called the spirituality of work. What does that mean, do you think? Basically, to John Paul, it meant that God is in everything, and that our work has to also be a reflection of what God is calling us to do, which is not only to take care of ourselves, but to take care of other people. In 1987, Pope John Paul wrote another encyclical on social concern. Why was he concerned? Well, he looked out over the world and continued to see that the third world populations were still suffering, while the first world countries were flourishing. And he said something's wrong with this. And so he addressed this failure of development in the third world countries. Also, the meaning and conditions and requirements for the development of a worthy person. What does that mean, he said? Are Americans and Europeans who are flourishing better than the little people living in Haiti or El Salvador or any of the other African countries that are depressed? So he talks in this encyclical about the differences between progress and development. He says that true development cannot be limited just to making more goods and services for people. That true development is really about contributing to the fullness of being a human being. I know these sound like very philosophical and lofty goals. You have to realize that John Paul had a big vision of people. He had been raised in Poland during the war. He saw what could happen with rampant disregard for human dignity. And so this runs through a lot of his encyclicals. 1991. It is now 100 years since Rerum Novarum, the first encyclical in 1891. John Paul II wrote this encyclical Centissimus Annus, the 100th year. And you can see on these bullet points, there are numbers that correspond to Rerum Novarum. He was simply going over again these basic principles that had been written about so long ago and that were still not put into practice. The rights to establish professional associations, the right to private property, the right to life, the right to discharge freely one's religious duties, the right to a just wage, and so on and so on. Again, defending and promoting the dignity and rights of human beings, regardless of their personal convictions. This was a very important document because it solidified how the church's social teachings would go into the future. In 1995, in response to many things that were going on in the world at the time, Pope John Paul wrote one of his most famous encyclicals, the Gospel of Life. Why did he write it? He wrote it because in the 90s, we were basically on the brink of engineering all kinds of life, from birth to death. He was very concerned with what he called the culture of death, the rising number of abortions, the rising number of people choosing euthanasia, the rising murders carelessly across the world, and the issue of capital punishment. John Paul wrote this beautiful Gospel of Life, basically just citing biblical, social, and ecological evidence that human beings are called to a fullness of life. Let's look at this quote I have here. He says, "Man is called to a fullness of life which far exceeds the dimensions of his earthly existence, because it consists in sharing the very life of God." His whole premise here in the social teachings was that if we are sharing in the very life of God, then that should be reflected in the choices, the ethical choices especially, the value choices that we make in this world. In 1998, Pope John Paul wrote yet another famous encyclical called Faith and Reason. Why did he write it? Well, once again, there was immense talk about how if you're a person of faith, then you have to suspend all reasoning because you can't reason scientifically prove the existence of God, heaven, or anything that is metaphysical. John Paul was a very intellectual guy. He was also a very artistic guy, and he was very good and very strong on philosophy. And he said that it was essential that we think of faith and reason together. He said faith without reason leads to superstition, and wouldn't we agree with that? But he also said that reason without faith leads to a sense of nihilism, nothingness, or relativism, depends on the situation. Isn't it interesting that he wrote this in 1998 and we are still grappling with this today, even more, but science has really pushed us to this point, technology as well. And many, many young people have left the faith because they think these two cannot be reconciled. If you know anybody like that, send them back to this beautiful encyclical on faith and reason. By 2005, Pope Benedict XVI was our Pope. One of his encyclicals, God is Love, was very influential. In this encyclical, Pope Benedict addresses love, but seen from a Christian perspective. Since we always talk about how God is love, he breaks it down into categories in this encyclical and reflects on the concepts of eros, agape, and philia, which are three Greek words and three aspects of love. And as he's reflecting on these, he shows their relationship with the teachings of Christ. And so in this encyclical then, the social teachings come out again. Because if we are really following this principle of love, we have to agree then that social justice is our primary responsibility. Benedict also said that it should be the responsibility of politics. And so those of us in the laity then, we should reflect this principle in our choices and how we live in the world and what our values are and so forth. 2 years later, in 2007, Pope Benedict wrote yet another encyclical, an apostolic exhortation on the Eucharist. Now remember what I said before. that this had been talked about in previous encyclicals on how our social teachings and our preferential option for the poor is all rooted in the Eucharist. Benedict was an immense intellectual. He had been writing on theology and philosophy all of his life. And this encyclical is very important because he highlights the social implications of the Eucharist and so beautifully connects it with the Church's social teachings. He divides the encyclical into 3 parts, and he talks about the Eucharist as a mystery to be first believed, second celebrated, and finally to be lived. And he kind of points out that we're pretty good at the first and the second, but we have a lot of work to do with the third, living out the social implications of the Eucharist in terms of social teachings. As with all of the encyclicals, you can tell what is foremost in the culture and in society because these encyclicals reflect what is most on the mind of the Pope in the modern day. In 2009, Pope Benedict XVI was very concerned about technology, the environment, immigration, bioethics, all kinds of things that we are still grappling with today, of course. His concern that we were not taking care of people in terms of world hunger, and that this idea of cultural relativism had grown so much that he wanted to offer a reflection on economic and social issues. And he said that the Church could be the teacher to inform the building of technological solutions and how we went about resolving these things without hurting anyone. He emphasized the need for the actions of everyone in the economic circle, that all of them should be informed by ethics, not just the profit motive. So here we go again with the Pope saying, you know, unbridled capitalism isn't good, and neither is socialism when it's forced upon people, that instead we have to be motivated by the teachings of Christ, that the dignity of the human person is the most important denominator in all of this. So, in Charity and Truth was very important in forming the social conscience of Catholics in this 21st century mode. By 2016, and still today, we have Pope Francis. And probably the most important encyclical he has written was one called Laudato Si, on care for our common home. Once again, what's on his mind? On his mind is global warming. On his mind is how we have exploited and consumed and been irresponsible about the development of land, the use of resources, and so forth. And so many people call this encyclical his encyclical about the environment. Throughout this encyclical, he laments environmental degradation, global warming, and all of the rest, and calls us, not just us Catholics, but everybody in the world, to take swift and unified global action. You can tell already that this is probably why he's been highly criticized, not only in secular circles, but also within the Church itself. Look at this quote. He said, "Nothing in this world is indifferent to us." I think you could probably write that, put it on a post-it, and put it on your wall. Nothing in this world is indifferent to us. Us meaning those that are following Christ. Think about it. you can see, as I said, why he is sometimes considered to be very controversial. Just last year, Pope Francis came out with another important encyclical called Fratelli Tutti, and by the way, I did a whole month's worth of reflections on Fratelli Tutti in January in my daily reflections on the blog. If you want to check them out, go to the Seeking Faith website. You'll see them there every single day. In this beautiful encyclical, Pope Francis says that fraternity, and he means men and women, and social friendship are the ways to build a better, more just, and peaceful world. He calls upon all people and all institutions to cooperate and to contribute to one another. This encyclical is a treatise against war and against globalized indifference. Within it as well, he speaks about having social friendships with different world religions too, so that all of us can work together to form a better world. So those are just some of the encyclicals, the important ones that have been written in the past 120 years regarding the social teachings of the Catholic Church. Through all of those encyclicals, you heard me basically spelling out the key principles. But let's go over them again, and I gave you 2 cards that have them summarized really well. So look in your packet if you want to see them written down specifically. Let's go over them. The first one has to do with life and dignity of the human person. Need I say it again? I think most of you know that the Catholic Church and all Christians believe that human life is sacred, and that the dignity of the human person is basically the foundation of a moral vision for society. Whenever human life is being threatened, and it could be by abortion, the death penalty, euthanasia, war, whatever it is, then the Church has to stand up and reaffirm the dignity of life. We cannot reduce human life to a product. No, we look at every human being as precious and way more important than the things they produce. The second principle is a call to family, community, and participation. Underlying the sacredness of human life is the fact that we are social beings. We live with each other. And so as a society, we have to band together and give individuals a capacity to grow. And that would mean nurturing the family as a central social institution and allowing people to be able to achieve a fulfillment in that community. We believe that, every person has a right and a duty to participate in society, and that no one is a throwaway person. We don't look at those who are poor and vulnerable as being nobody. Rather, we call for all of us to stand up in solidarity. We also insist that the government and other institutions protect human right and human dignity and promote the common good. The third principle spells out the rights and responsibilities. Again, we have to protect human dignity to create a healthy community. We have the right to life, not only just to live, but to the things that can help us live a productive life. And therefore, we have duties and responsibilities to one another, to our families, to larger communities. So both personal and social responsibility is necessary. The next teaching has to do with the option for the poor and vulnerable. Here's a really basic principle. A moral test for any society is how we treat the most vulnerable among us. If there are deepening divisions between the rich and the poor, we will be judged by that. We can look in the Gospel of Matthew and see what he says about the Last Judgment. So at the Last Judgment, we're going to be asked not how well we prayed or what we accomplished, but how do we treat the poor and vulnerable among us. That's going to be the litmus test. So it's very important that this option for the poor and vulnerable is at the foremost of our lives. The next teaching has to do with the dignity of work and the rights of workers. Throughout the encyclicals, you could see this. All the popes say that the marketplace economy has to serve the people, not the other way around. We work to make a living. There's an expression, do you live to work or work to live? You know, I think it's an important question, especially today, now that we have technology and we're working more than ever. We can work 24/7 if we want to because we have computers. But is that really the purpose of our lives? Also, we have to look at the basic right of everyone to have a fair wage, to be able to have private property, all of us. We have to respect the rights that promote an economy that protects human life. And that's what we're all about, supposedly in America, and yet, are we really? That's the question here. The next teaching has to do with solidarity. Once again, we're not isolationists. Jesus makes it clear in the Gospels that we are our brothers and sisters' keepers, wherever they live. We're one human family, no matter where we live, our national, racial, ethnic, economic, or ideological differences. If we really are called to love our neighbor, it doesn't mean the person that lives next to us alone. It has global dimensions in this interdependent world. There's also the teaching that talks about the care of God's creation. We are the stewards of this planet. We're called to protect it so that the people who come after us can enjoy the fruits of it as well. Why? Because it's deeply connected in faith in our relationship with all of God's creation. And so the environmental challenge then is fundamental. It has moral and ethical dimensions that cannot be ignored. So finally then, after I've talked about all this, probably the most important thing for you to think about now is what is your response to Catholic social teachings? And maybe not just your response to encyclicals or philosophies or ideologies, but really, how are you living your life? Are the social teachings part of your values? How you work, what you share, how you care for the environment, how concerned you might be with people less fortunate than you are. All of these things are part of a deepening sense of what it means to follow Christ, and especially now that you're Catholic, it has to do with the faith you have decided to embrace. So give this a good think, do some soul searching, write down some questions, and let's talk about this further when we come together on Sunday. See you then.